Manchester Game Centre is an organisation that is kind of like a research group across Man-Met. They've been very generous in supporting this festival. Their remit is to kind of support research around games across different aspects. So today we're going to have a panel where we kind of explore some of the topics around games and diversity, crossing the industry, and some of the hot topics that we hope we don't get in trouble for. So to start, I thought we'd keep it light and maybe kind of go around the panel, ask, what is our favourite diverse video game character?
When I was a kid, it was Chun-Li. Because, I was a big Street Fighter fan, and it's like, Dalsim to a 6-year-old girl is not an appealing character whatsoever. It's like, yeah, he's brown, but yeah, Chun-Li, the massive thighs, as a whole.
Yeah.
I think after Stuart's talk yesterday, you can see why the kicks are so powerful.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, that checks out.
Yeah.
So, sorry, this is Darshanna. Darshanna is from Dr. Darshanna is from the University of Abertay, and is a researcher in games and performativity. But yes, what is your
I would say the boss from Metal Gear Solid 3.
right?
Yeah. Is that diverse enough? Do I have to make it? Just pretty awesome.
So I'm a big Street Fighter 2 fan. So
Yeah.
I don't mind Dalsim, kind of a caricature.
Yeah.
But I think a really powerful moment for me was when I was playing, I think, Far Cry 2, and I came across an NPC called Kurbani Singh, and it turned out from the lore he was a Mauritian character.
Oh, wow.
So that was the very first time I ever saw someone represented in video games that was from my background, and it made a huge impact. I might as well throw it out to the audience as well. So how about anyone in the audience? Have they got like a favorite video game character that maybe reflects your heritage? Anyone you've played? Yeah? So, across here.
Thank you. So, I mean, Geralt the Witcher, the whole Witcher universe, I think it's so beautifully done by CDPR and really reflects the Slavic culture very, very well. I mean, that Geralt is such a cool character, and I mean, he's awesome, and yeah, I think he's mine. Yeah.
So do you play the game, does it have Polish audio? Are you able to play it like that, yeah?
So initially, because I was so obsessed with learning English as fast as possible, I played it in English. However, originally it was done in Polish. And when I switched back, it's different because the translation gets a little bit lost. The jokes are a little bit darker in Polish, and it's just swear word after swear word. It's so funny. It's amazing. So I do play it in Polish now. So yeah.
Anyone else seen themselves in games?
I really like Echo from League of Legends. Not because I watched Arcane, because I'm a League of Legends player. And at the time, they had balanced him to be extremely overpowered. But then I looked into the lore, and he's just like a nerdy little black kid, and that is literally me.
And Jade at the back, yeah?
Hello. I think at the moment it's Sun Wukong from the Wukong games, just because I think it's really interesting to see how very Chinese, you can't get any more Chinese than Sun Wukong, Chinese culture in like such a mainstream AAA space. So at the moment that'll be for me. Yeah.
Great. So we'll kind of, touching upon that, I guess I'll kind of ask the panel, what do you feel like the reality of diverse representation is like in games right now? Do you have an idea of what the impact of like the current US rhetoric might have on media production and representation in games that are coming out right now? Is that a temporary phase? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think, so there's kind of, two things going on. I think lots of platform holders, like PlayStation, folks like that, are really interested in emerging markets. And so I think there is definitely that desire to like open up those spaces, and they realize they kind of have to do it with culturally specific narratives, and things that make sense for, like why would a Chinese audience that actually is so well served by developers coming from there, making all of these great stories, not demand that, But on the other hand, I do think it's a hard time to make games that are perceived as political in any way. And I think, there's such a America-centrism in the industry and in the funding model. So I'm currently working on this game called All Rise, which is secretly about climate activists and taking on billionaires, but we're sort of making, but the way we talk about it really has to shift and change, because I think that's a really hard sell to fund right now. And it's just like, I don't know how climate crisis is a hard sell to fund right now. I feel like it's never been sort of more prevalent and present in all of our lives. But I think, capital is always risk averse and fearful. And but that doesn't mean that the audiences aren't there looking for these things. So I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And so there are two academics, Tara Fickle and Chris Patterson, who wrote a paper recently called "Diversity is Not a Win Condition." And I think there's this kind of difficulty with, we know that there's problems with representation, that it could be broader. But do we want to get to a state where there's proportional representation, or do we want to be more ambitious than that? There's this kind of like larger question of like, what are we kind of aiming for overall? And I'm responsible for like all of these very serious academic books that are on the, so you can just take a photo of this and you'll kind of like get a good kind of like introduction to some of the wider issues. But we're going to keep it pretty light. It's not like, don't get
Well,
full. Like,
as you
Okay.
said, you're going to keep it pretty light. Just
No.
just based on what you were saying, Darshanna. Actually, so one of the things that I wrestle with in the industry, right, is that actually a lot of the movements towards diversity that are happening in big AAA spaces, and they're happening in games that I would say are very much like, say, part of the American imperial war machine. So Call of Duty has like a brown female character, and it's very hard for me to, I'm a bit like, yay, more female drone operators about it, right?
have we gotten to the imperial war machine already?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. But we're
It's
keeping
under
it
5
light.
minutes.
But right, like, and the thing is, I can see that also, it in some ways, it like ticks the boxes of a very sort of corporate co-opted idea of like diversity and inclusion, right? Where, let's make sure that the employees of Lockheed Martin are racially diverse. Like, I don't know that that's actually a great goal for us, right? And so even with this sort of Call of Duty thing, I think it is a realistic, there were many brown and black developers in-house that really pushed for that and feel kind of seen and represented by that. And so I think we also really have to question our kind of broader political goals around this, right? Like, what does it mean to be seen and by who? And like, is it a win condition? I think that, it was really you saying that made me wonder that. Is it a win condition that, and as well, like in India right now with Modi and the increasing rise of authoritarian and fascism there, it sort of makes sense that this game about war and kind of oppression is featuring this brown character, and it's also, representing maybe a Hindutva right wing. And does that, I kind of deny that as representation for me personally.
Yeah. I think there's something there about the nature of representation that is interesting. So just having, say, a brown or a black character or a person of certain ethnicity that's very surface level.
Yeah.
With games, the specific techniques that you can use, you can do things through mechanics like you were talking about with Thirsty Suitors. But you can also run into essentialization, because if you put race as a game mechanic, it exists in that world in a way that's not just surface level. Like, if certain people learn at certain rates, it's kind of a racist sort of an idea. So you've got to be careful about like how you use the powers that games have, the unique kind of traits of the medium when you're doing something like including race. I don't think it's as simple as like diversifying and bringing everyone in. It's like the modality in which you bring them in is also important to think about.
I was actually listening to a talk from one of the designers of, I think it was Mafia 2 or 3, and forgive me.
3, I think it was.
Yeah. And he's a black man, and was actually discussing that one of the things that he pushed for and put into the game was that you play a black protagonist who's a Vietnam War veteran, who's like kind of, really, really experiencing a breakdown over the course of the game. And one of the things he pushed for and got was that when you as the protagonist walk by like nice white ladies in the game, they pull their purses closer and kind of clutch them closer, which is an experience that, he really had. And it's an interesting one, right? It goes to, that is a way in which those mechanics see race. And it really works in that game because it really, the a lot of the game is about that racialized experience, and that's kind of accurate to that. And I thought that was really, I think, really powerful to represent, maybe uncomfortable as well. And I think what he was saying was that actually it was really more white players that experienced discomfort at that, right? Which I also think that's a really helpful thing to do, to be thinking about who your audience is and who you want to make feel seen and comfortable and uncomfortable. And I think that's going to be happening, at kind of multiple levels. And I think unsettling the power structures and people and ideas that need to be unsettled is like a good goal for us to have, I think.
So like that's a couple of great examples, Call of Duty and Mafia 3, but in some ways are they kind of rarities? Is it futile to try and like fight for our representation in these spaces, or do you think the indie gaming sphere is an easier or more viable path for more in-depth representation around a kind of realization of race?
Yeah, I mean, I think AAA is all, I think once these ideas reach AAA, it's kind of, I feel like in some ways it's a great thing because you've sort of won the argument, right? And like even your corporate overlords are celebrating whatever Diversity Day or their pride flags. But you also, I think we've really seen in the current political climate how empty so much of that is, right? The moment the winds change, these are not, corporations don't really have real commitments to any of this. And the moment that they are happy, like it works for them to abandon you as an audience, they will. So I do think that there's like there's a real healthy skepticism to greet all of those changes, right? And I think to place it solely upon like, well, it's like the market forces dictate that diversity is good, and it's like, yeah, should we not maybe be doing it for some kind of moral reason? Perhaps also like is the dollar the only metric by which we decide how we behave? I think in indie, there's a lot more space for that, but I also think we really lack in order to find these new audiences and in order to fund these new games and new ideas, we really need funding in order to do that. And so, like, I'm just going back on the same idea. Yeah, the dollar is kind of the thing, right? How, unfortunately, I think even attention is so commoditized now. That it's so hard to do this kind of work. And I'm constantly frustrated by the fact that, like, actually indie functions as like an and hobbyists as well. I mean, let's not just, ignore that. The vast majority of the games industry is actually not fully employed. Like Brendan Keogh has a great book about that called The Video Games Industry Does Not Exist, where he really talks about how the majority of people who work in games are hobbyists, are casual, are part-time. So that is the majority of their industry. It's an R&D lab for AAA. And they do kind of feast upon all of our work and take our ideas. And, and if you really want a healthy, thriving industry, these larger players should actually be pouring money into us because it benefits them as well. But that sounds far too sensible.
Yeah,
for this late
I mean,
capitalist
that's a key
technoscape.
point, I think, which is that they can do a 180, as we've seen very easily. Like, diversity, DEI programs in the United States have been just kind of wound back. And that happens it's the funding spigot. That one, they can always take it away. They always have that kind of capability. But I think with intellectual property as well, this kind of like, race is in some ways baked so much into some games. Like Dungeons and Dragons has recently changed things such that two types of characters, orcs and dark elves, have been taken out of the monster part of the game and put into the player character part of the game. So that is like a mechanical change that has, and to what degree can you change that and still have it be Dungeons and Dragons? Like this kind of history of the game itself playing into, real world racial kind of distinctions. I
mean, I think, and there's the broader question for me though, which is also that like race and species are often interchanged in this, right? Like, and so the easiest way to the games industry would much rather talk about race when we're talking about fantasy races like orcs and elves, because that's somehow more comfortable to step back from that. But you see time and time again that the veil of metaphor gets you into real trouble, because you end up saying things thematically and narratively and otherwise that you may not even intend, but are like devastatingly damaging. I mean, so I think you can look as a nice counterexample at, like, say, the X-Men, right? And the original comics were very much deliberate metaphor for the homosexual community, for queer people and their persecution. There's still some difficulty there because, like, the mutant metaphor means that, like, this persecuted minority has an enormous amount of power and they're actually dangerous in some ways, whereas like, that is generally not true of like normal queer people just trying to live their lives, right? And so it almost justifies a greater institutional kind of policing and control of them. But again, I think this is the thing, is that these are, the minute you make real people a metaphor, it's a very, very dangerous game to play. And if you know, and especially with sprawling IPs like this, you know, the control often slips out of the initial creator's hands and into like multiple hands. And I often think, like, actually a lot of these things, like even sort of racism, white supremacy, all of these things, they really thrive in obscurity, and it's really clarity that is a very helpful idea. And I worry about some of this stuff, that it adds to the kind of obscurity, confusion, and that there's something around, oh no, but we also want it to be fun to play or be racist to each other, or like naturalizing this idea that in any world, even a massive fantasy world with like huge dragons and mind flayers, like, but we must have racism. Like, how can society exist without racism? And you're like,
Or people being like, there wouldn't be people of color in a European-based setting, and it's like, but dragons and like elves and dwarves and all kinds of stuff are okay. I blame Tolkien, but it's there's because conflict drives a lot of narrative, or at least that's kind of like what people are told, like narrative in that kind of hero's journey kind of way. Conflict is the engine of that, and that gets baked into the kind of games that people want to make. And they often borrow from these real-world scenarios of oppression and war and violence, and they want that drama, but without, like, can you strip it from the actual history, and to what extent do you get into trouble when you try to do that?
yeah. Definitely.
Well, I mean, we kind of touched upon Mafia 3 just before, kind of like maybe a good example of representation in the AAA sphere. But do you think there's, I mean, you kind of touched upon the different experiences that maybe white players have when playing as that character. But do you think there are ethical or psychological issues to consider when non-white gamers can play diverse characters offline? I guess we expect that people will come away with a great understanding of racism, but do you ever worry about people kind of race playing in a way and playing into, Mafia 3 is a great game, as is GTA San Andreas, but at the end of the day, they are still criminals and they're still murderers. And do you ever worry about that aspect?
I think it's an interesting one, right? And I think I ask this question in general when a game invites you to play someone oppressed. I'm thinking about like Deus Ex here, right? Like where you are playing someone who's augmented, who's part of a wider oppressed sort of group, and it's sort of fantastical, so you can slightly maybe get away with it in some ways, but the fantasy of escaping the oppression is often like, so it was so interesting. You're living in an apartheid state, you're sitting in the back of the bus, you try and move to the front of the bus, and this is like, it's so on the nose, right? And someone challenges you, and then you whip out your like, I'm a policeman card, and actually they're like, oh no, it's fine. So you're playing out this fantasy of being oppressed, but you're unwilling to commit to actually being oppressed in any way, right? And so it just seems really like a very sort of shallow way to kind of cope with this. And actually there's almost a failure of imagination on the devs' part of like, how, even if I am oppressed by society or by structures, like we all live under patriarchy, but I feel like it's really obvious that not all women are like perfect victims who have no agency or control or power. Like we might all be limited in some ways, but human beings are like incredible at finding ways to express kind of power, right? But I think it goes back to sort of what you were saying earlier, also about the verbs of a game, right? Like when so much of it is just about like brute force or violence. All of these nuances of agency and expression are a bit less hard to kind of come across, really, I guess.
I mean, you do a fair bit of work in this kind of field of performativity. Like, can you expand upon that? What your thoughts are?
I think, I mean, we've been very, very critical so far. But, I mean, just seeing that performance at lunch, the dance performance, like that was extraordinarily beautiful. And there's games are such a powerful medium for conveying and communicating culture. I think there's definitely a role for expanding the the possibilities maybe with motion capture. And there's a lot of people who have like said that ephemeral art forms like dance around the world, there's maybe the opportunity for cultural preservation through incorporating them. So I think there's positive like kind of opportunities there as well, using technology that we often include in games and stuff that is worth looking at and keeping in mind.
No,
It's not all
totally.
bad.
Yeah, and also like I think with the democratization of lots of these game making tools as well, right? Like it's never been, it's getting easier, and it's never been more easy to kind of make your own game or be a solo dev or be able to, like, thanks to the internet and social media and organizers, to be able to like find people and then collaborate even outside of your geographic space. And I do think that is also why we're seeing so many great, really interesting games from people from all kinds of perspectives. Like, I realize, given that we've been super negative, in the recent couple of years, 1,000 Times Resist, which is made by a small sort of diaspora Chinese team based in Canada, which is also about the Hong Kong riots and also about mothers and daughters and the immigrant experience, but all told through this like epic sci-fi narrative. It's so cool. It's so interesting. Like, it's one of my favorite games of all time, I think. And you know, it's amazing to see what they achieved as well, because actually, to Darshanna's point, the team is actually pulling from loads of different disciplines. So from set design, from contemporary art, from all of those things. And you can really see those influences kind of reinvigorating the games industry and like level design and lighting and just how you're kind of invited to move around these spaces. You know, I just look at the amount of work that tiny team did, and it just really, it should send shockwaves through like every big AAA studio where, oh, here's another corridor, you know? It's really extraordinary. And then also Jenny Xiao's team just made Consume Me, which I'm not sure is publicly available yet, but it just swept the IGF Awards. And it's about a young Asian American girl, but it's like this kind of QWOP style game. I don't know if you've played like Bennett Foddy's QWOP, but you're just kind of slightly out of control of your own body. And if you've ever been a teenage girl, you will know that that's kind of how it feels. And it's really, it's a game about food and dating and self-image, but it's like so fun and so frenetic and so energetic. Like, and it's so I've never felt a game that makes you feel so inside that feeling of being like an insecure teenager, and it's like so beautiful. Despelotti as well, which I think is about to come out soon, which is set in Ecuador in the late 90s after this financial crash, but you're playing this little boy whose only interest is like, you know, playing with his football and escaping. All of the adults are like, you know, kind of consumed with the economy and politics and all of these things, and you're just like, no, but can I escape school and go and kick the ball around with my friends? And there's something really beautiful about it.
I think that one's particularly interesting as well because, and they won the audio award at the IGF, and the soundscape that they create is really unique.
Yeah.
And one of my colleagues is Ecuadorian, and he said this is the soundscape of what it was like in. So I think because in games a lot of the time, like every part of an environment has been constructed by someone with an intentionality. Unlike in film, like documentary film, where you can get this serendipity kind of happening, and there can be things, you know, in the background they don't predict, or like this kind of, there's much more sort of, so expanding the set of techniques that are involved in creating games, I think, has a lot of potential as well, where you can use photogrammetry, or you can use, you know, innovative audio techniques to capture, you know, a soundstage or something in a different way. That's an exciting thing that's happening at the moment. People are just trying so much, like Judero, Jack King Spooner's game, which is just claymation or like plasticine kind of models that he's kind of animated. Is just the most Scottish thing that I've ever kind of experienced. But also kind of just Ray Harryhausen for contemporary times, and just so different, which is awesome.
There's also this really lovely team who are making this game, interactive art thing called Project Pomegranate, who are really interested in preserving places that are currently being destroyed in Gaza by the war. And so it's kind of, again, like a game walking simulator acting as like a way of preserving history or reconstructing history that now is no longer accessible, in creating like a digital archive or a record, as well as like reimagining things that there are no photographs of, and there's maybe no archaeological evidence of, but like reimagining it based on like some oral storytelling and things like that. And I think all of that is like so interesting and so powerful
Yeah.
as well.
So, I mean, that sounds like a great example, but do you think, as you said before, like one of the primary verbs for video games is kill and defeat and combat, maybe more so for the AAA sphere. Like, do you feel we can trust video games to tackle issues, around conflict, particularly in, maybe non-westernized areas like, the Sudan and Palestine? Like those issues might be worth covering, but do we feel like with the way the games are created and centered around mechanics of violence, is it a fair expectation for them to tackle it at AAA or?
Yeah,
Or
I
at
I'm not sure that AAA studios should be tackling the war in Gaza, no.
No.
But there's recently Rashid's wonderful project, Dreams on a Pillow. He's a Palestinian developer based in the West Bank and is making games under occupation. He also made Layla and the Shadows of War, which is really exciting. So, and this game, it's about his real experiences. As part of the Kickstarter, he has like a contingency plan for if he's like detained or disappeared, which is just like, I complain about my working conditions, and it really puts it into perspective, and I think that's really beautiful. I think as with all kinds of art, right? Like, it can be done well, it can be done badly. Should we trust anyone? Should we particularly be trusting like large mega corporations or studios to do so? Hell no, we should not trust them, and we should absolutely. And I think that's the power of also critique in a way. Like, and I think it's important. While we're sort of a little bit rolling our eyes at like cancel culture and all of these things, I do think it's important to remember that a lot of the origins of that are really normal, ordinary people getting to say to people with enormous amounts of wealth, power, and influence, like, no, actually, maybe think about that a little bit more. And I do think that's really valuable. And I think it's from that critique. It's amazing how thin-skinned even very wealthy games executives are. Like, they do read all of the comments, which is kind of a bit sad, but it's also, I think it's a way in which the industry progresses, right? I mean, I will tell you this about my time on Horizon Zero Dawn. Part of the reason that studio made Horizon Zero Dawn Guerrilla was because the previous 2 or 3 games had been so viciously panned for their narrative that the executives and C-suite gave a whole bunch of money to the narrative team and said, fix this. I mean, it's the first time I think Metacritic has actually had a positive impact in the industry, but...
So this is what it takes.
Yeah, this is what it takes, yeah. And I was like, so actually, that it is a way in which that feedback and that change works, and I think it's only through that I would say we could trust people to do this, right? If they know that they're going to be held to account, and if they have a certain, I think any of us taking on any project have a certain amount of healthy fear. I think every creative should. Not in a like, oh, I can't say this is unsayable, but like, I want to do a good job at this. Like, I think that's just a craft question, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe that also requires having a soul.
I mean, that like any kind of creative endeavor is very risky.
Yeah.
And there
it should be.
many other ways you could be spending your time.
Yeah.
And that are more likely, and from an investor point of view, more likely to get return on investment. So anything that they perceive as lowering that possibility, that's just the way that it kind of works. But so it needs to be, like, if you're going to do diversity, there needs to be resource behind it. It needs to be real resource.
Absolutely. And I think also we've seen like some really great examples of games that are dealing with war. Like, I think This War of Mine is one of the most like beautiful games about war and conflict. And it's really not about shooting or combat. It's really about you are playing a group of civilians during wartime, and you just kind of have to survive this bombardment, keep the morale of your team together, go on scavenging missions, and it's like, it's really human. And many of the dev team of 11-bit who are based in Poland, like, that you can tell that they on the team or their friends or family have had experience of war, and like and they take it seriously. So again, like, I think it's not really the topic. I think actually you can make almost any story really banal if you say, right, shooting is how we progress through it, to be honest. Like, it might make more sense in war, but frankly, we're doing it for everything, right? Like, and actually the most interesting stories of war are not ones that take place at the barrel of a gun, I think, as well.
Yeah. So we had a mention of Black Myth Wukong.
Yeah.
So we're starting to see, I guess, the rise of kind of Chinese-produced games, but possibly even really big ones, big budget games, crossing over to the West, which is really interesting and impressive. Where do you see maybe the opportunities for, India, China, and, Africa as a continent? Like, is this an opening market for them to be exporting to the West, or should they be concentrating on developing new forms, new characters that are more domestically appealing? Is that a folly to try and chase this established Western market?
I mean, I think Jade's point about Black Myth is that it's like so Chinese. I think is a great example of this, right? Like that actually, it's not in attempting to appeal to the Western market that they created this mega hit. It's by making something that really speaks to them and that is really different. Because I actually think it's really interesting in a way, like how simultaneously, like I look at indie, it's never been more diverse and more interesting, and not just in terms of like race or gender, or I'm talking about in terms of like mechanics and ideas and ways of thinking. And I look at AAA and it's never felt more stultified to me. And that's partly because of the ballooning budgets and, the risk aversion and the fact that we're still targeting and trying to like, it's like trying to extract more from the same field. Like it's the same group of people that we're laser focused on as an audience. And you're like, they're tired. They have 6 huge, massive AAA games a year coming out. Like, they also have to go out and have lives, guys. And there's all of these other audiences. But I think people are really hungry for anything that feels different. And, like, storytelling traditions are different in China. So I'm obsessed with Chinese historical dramas and also romances. And I went on a, like, year-long cleanse of Anglophone media, really, because I was like, it's impossible not to be affected by like narrative structures and expectations. And it's so interesting to me, like the Chinese contemporary rom-com has a totally different structure than like than like an English language one. Not that we're making a shitload of rom-coms anymore, though they are coming back in film. And so I think, even that, it's not just the characters, it's not just the ideas, it's not just the culture, it's just, I think even the structures of storytelling are different, and that feels really exciting to Western audiences as well.
I hope like it will lead to new business models, like because there's different kind of like financial constraints in different parts of the world, different opportunities, different barriers. That would be really interesting to see how the business side of things develops. But there's just so many worlds and stories out there to explore. Like we've heard about like Slavic culture, Chinese culture, and Orion was a RPG set in that kind of like that breadth of like cultural treasure that humanity possesses is only beginning to be explored by games. Whereas film and literature, a lot of other art forms have been doing it for such a long time. There's a lot to learn. Especially if you like take Stuart's advice on constructing creatures that make sense and like build some kind of the Chinese dragons, all these fascinating kind of like creatures.
We've also seen the rise, or maybe it's been like this for a while, the rise in kind of outsourcing production to Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
I mean, do you see this as a kind of a necessity to build up that knowledge in those areas and build up this kind of the scene in those areas of games development? Or do you think this is kind of another form of neoliberal colonialism where, we fight for representation and unions and better pay in the West and then sweep under the carpet and outsource that to Southeast Asia?
I mean, I think it's happening regardless, because capitalism always makes money at where there's a delta, where there is a distinction, in value. So can we like kind of ensure that? I mean, it's a difficult one, I think. But the skill sets are becoming more common, and the business knowledge, all the skills that you need are becoming more and more common around the world outside of the usual kind of like bailiwick of the Western games industry. So it's going to happen, and it's going to be interesting, but trying to make sure that it's equitable.
People Make Games had this great expose about an outsourcing company in Singapore, I think, recently. And they had a wonderful line in it, which is essentially like, crunch is now a commodity, and we are exporting it to the global south as we get rid of it here. And I mean, that sounds pretty colonial to me. And I do also think that there is also that very, very colonial capitalist mindset of like, oh, these people here, like, yes, we're skilling them up, but they're able to do like basic tasks, but not necessarily be in charge of creative direction, right? Like, and I think that's a really infantilizing way to look at the people who are like, I think anyone here who's technical knows just how creative even those technical skills are. So I really do agree with Darshanna, right? Like, it's really important for us to kind of work out a way to be ethical here. And I think we're looking at this in the games are following every other industry it's like it's super globalized and there's all of these supply chains and it's like, oh, the clothing manufacturer here has no idea that a bunch of children were locked into a factory in Bangladesh somehow because it's like a series of shell companies. And, I think it's worth us being alive to that in the games industry.
I think
now.
the extraordinary range of value that this technology can create is, so there's fan labor, there's, streamers, all of these different kind of ways of contributing to games and games culture. I think there was this is a very unfortunate example, but someone from a major multiplayer gaming company said that maybe kids in the Philippines can play the NPCs for, and everyone was kind of like, oh my God.
Sounds like an episode of Black Mirror.
Extremely, yeah, it does, but people said this. Like,
yeah.
So, but there are so many different ways that games create community value culture. I think that diversifying around the world is exciting, and as long as we think about equitable distribution of that value.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just feel like you see that I think like crypto and crypto games are like the perfect way. I think sometimes you have to look at the worst bits of the industry to see like, oh, where are the innovations and exploitation happening? And I think you really see that in like the crypto game space, where you really do see people like hiring low-paid workers or like kids in the global south in order to like farm their crypto so that they can, and so I feel like maybe
or gold farmers.
Right, absolutely, right. And I think you see that in general, like the NFT is no longer a thing here, but like I think last winter I went to Bangalore and like there's just a whole bunch of like seminars and basically every bad idea is just exported gently to kind of the global south and people there are exploited. So I think, sorry, it's like maybe a little bit depressing. I'm just like, everything that we can imagine that the games industry will be bad at doing is going to happen, because like I think that's just the space that we're in. And so I'm really keen on like actually us all educating ourselves and getting a little bit collectively organized, because I really think that there is very little trust. And I think actually what we shouldn't allow for is like complacency about these things, because I think I think the great thing about this type of technology is that it's like disruptive in that way. We can move this. It's still, none of it is so bedded in, or like that we haven't been doing this thing for generations that we then have to like slowly change. But that does mean also that like bad things can get much worse very quickly, I think. Yeah.
So with your previous talk, I really enjoyed it. Obviously, I really enjoyed the game. One of the things that we mentioned was intersectionality. And this festival, we're largely talking about race. What do you think people of color can do to support or engage with or represent kind of queer games developers or gamers within this kind of gaming space?
Yeah, I think we got to do it. So like I realized like in my previous talk, I didn't at any point say like I am a brown queer woman, which is why Jala is a brown queer woman, and it's probably useful to be explicit about that. So it's like that. I think the reality is that lots of people of color are also queer, and also and I think if we can find a way to really build on those solidarities. I think a really big first step is also like addressing the rubbish in our own house, and I think we kind of have to look within and clean our own house a little bit, which sometimes might mean having difficult conversations with mummy, daddy, and like Uncle Rajiv or whatever, and kind of objecting to some of that shit, because I do think we all kind of have a responsibility to make things safer for each other. I do also think for me, like when you ask that, I also think about like my experience in a lot of like, say, white queer spaces or white leftist spaces or organizing spaces. And I have really found, like, when race is when the people in the room don't really have a commitment to, race is also present here and race is really important. Like, when it's just like, oh no, but actually, like, we get it because we're also marginalized. It's like, no, it's different. Like, yes, there's a solidarity there, but we're also different. Like, I can't say, like, that I understand the trans experience either, and I shouldn't. Like, that would be incredibly arrogant of me as a cis person. I can say, well, I'm here in solidarity with you, but I'm also here to learn. And I think when race isn't present in some of those spaces, I think things quickly go bad, because fundamentally the structures of the world are already creating all of these hierarchies, and if we're not, like, actively pushing against them, they tend to remanifest. Just like, I'm sure if you've been in many rooms in the games industry, you will find, like, fewer women, and that means that women speak less, or, like, and you really kind of have to make an effort to do that, and I think lots of us are engaged in this work. But yeah, I think it is work, and I think pretending it isn't work does it a disservice.
Well, I was going to, like, definitely, yeah, you just made my point for me. But, like, it's who's doing the work as well, because I was just talking to Adam from Pop and Play last night, and he was like, we're all really busy. Like, we've got day jobs and, like, families and stuff, and, like, I'm not a race or ethnicity scholar. I'm a media and communications scholar. I'm like, how did I end up
your hobby.
doing diversity stuff? It's just because I had no freaking choice. The forces of the world have, like, been such that I've ended up probably studying this stuff more than the stuff I'm supposed to be studying. And it's that kind of, like, so resourcing it appropriately. And the work is really hard because you make mistakes all the time, because you can't understand other people's experience unless you actually talk to them. You tread on toes, you kind of, like, take wrong turns, and that's hard, difficult work to do.
Well, I guess, all the work shouldn't in theory be on our shoulders. So I guess on a more positive note, like, what do you think that our white allies, or our friends and colleagues, what could we say to them, or what should they be considering doing to support us in industry, or us as representations in the media?
Yeah, I think some self-reflection there is important as well. Like, as you were saying, cleaning our own house, maybe some of the ways that nerfing ourselves just in our own, like, kind of minds. And it's like not going for stuff in the first place, or and looking at our classrooms about who's making games or who wants to make games. Like, these pipeline problems. That's a horrible term, but.
But do you think, say working in the studio and you've got a lot of white friends and white bosses, if you were to speak to those, like, whether it's a futile attempt or not, what do you think they could be doing, or maybe some of the students in the audience, what can they consider to do to be better allies in this space?
I think go and see and play and engage with the work of people of color, right? Like, and I think this is the thing. I think there's this sort of ingrained idea because of dominant culture that, like, a white protagonist is for everyone, and then a brown protagonist feels niche. So one of the most frustrating responses to thirsty suitors would be, like, when white streamers would play this game and be like, so I'm not the audience for this game, but I really love it, you should play it. And I'm like, why? Do you have a family? Have you had relationships before? Like, then you're the audience for the game. It's for you. Just because there's a brown face on it doesn't mean it's niche. So I think getting over that hurdle of this is not for me. Yeah, it is for you. It may not be, like, for you, like, looking in a mirror for you, but it is for you. And please don't, so I have a counterexample, which is, like, please don't be this person who's, like, I talked to this, like, white acquaintance of mine who is, like, and I was like, oh, but we were talking about Black Panther, and she was like, yeah, no, but I'm not going to go opening weekend, because I don't want to intrude on this black space. And I was like, go to the fucking cinema. Like, no, that's not being an ally. That's you. Anyway, so that's the thing. I think it's like, just go engage with our work and, like, convince the corporate overlords who have money that, like, actually people are interested.
I mean, sometimes when, you know, I work with some great students.
Go to the box office, most importantly. Like,
don't not go on opening weekend because you may be intruding. Like, that's, yeah.
Well, sometimes, you know, some developers I speak with who are sympathetic and want to do more, sometimes live in a kind of state of fear or paralysis of doing the wrong thing, of not doing representation right. You know, is that something they should be afraid of, or should they be taking proactive steps to do it right?
You know, I just also, not to be a dick about it, but like, let's all grow up. Like, being wrong is part of like life. And I think getting good at being wrong is a really like nice thing to do. And, you know,
especially
like,
if you're on management money, like you should be able to kind of like take responsibility a bit.
Absolutely, right? And also I think, you know, the idea that like the woke mob has a guillotine outside every room and like being cancelled doesn't actually mean that most of the people were cancelled are making shitloads more money than they are now. You know, so actually the consequences are a little bit of social shame, and like that's okay. Trust me, it won't kill you. Like, and it's good. Like, actually, shame is not the worst thing. Like, shame performs lots of really good functions. I'm not saying that, like as an Indian woman is, like, very dangerous. Like, there's all sorts of shames that you should completely ignore. But I think it's okay. Like, I think part of that is also that maybe we need to all stop pretending that we're so pure, right? And I think there is a really nuanced thing to also understanding someone's, like, intentionality. And we are going to disagree about the boundaries of some of it, right? And like, obviously, you know, we need to be in a place where people aren't harmed, but also sometimes hearing hard things isn't harm. So again, like, I think these are kind of nuanced things that we need to actually like be grown up about. And I think these are also things that like we have to acknowledge. We live in this societal, like, social media thrives on our outrage and virality and I think there's a way in which like we start thinking when we're on there as well. You're like constantly like wanting to critique or tear people down or like, you know, make the hot take or whatever. And I don't know that that's really sort of helpful, right? Like, I think we are all feeling increasingly atomized and lonely and all of these things. And I think relearning how to live in community is part of that. Like, I think and I really think that, you know, personally, and I know people may have had different experiences, like, there have been times where I have, like, misgendered someone. I have, like, fucked up on someone's name. I've mispronounced something. And the actually most marginalized people that I have made a mistake with have been so kind and so gracious and so willing to, like, see past all of that. Mostly because most of them are really used to it. Like, I'm used to correcting people about pronouncing my name. Like, I'm going to roll my eyes a little bit, but, like,
I got a cab, and the cab rolled up with Satan instead of Satish once. So
I'll
let that pass.
That's an upgrade. Right?
That's so cool, man.
Kenny, you know, Kenny shared a really, you know, touching, vulnerable moment, you know, earlier. I think it really speaks to that, where, you know, all we can really do is try, and you know, it's not the end of the world if we do face some pushback. I guess the point is really trying. So.
But I think that example is like, these are complex terrains that we're trying to navigate. It is not easy, and there are some times where it will lead to a outcome that only time can heal.
Yeah.
And that's just the nature of cultural exchange and like having different people working in similar places.
Yeah.
I would definitely recommend out of this. So I've kind of constructed this. If you do want to like kind of get across things, you know, efficiently, Keon West's recent book, The Science of Racism, that is really good because he's an experimental psychologist and he runs through the scientific evidence for the existence of racism. It's like there is scientific consensus, and people can, you know, there's very clever experiments that people have done. For example, like using CVs and the response rates to CVs to demonstrate it. It's not a matter of opinion, and he's very level-headed. He's he doesn't give any political opinions, and then he, like at the end of the book, he kind of like goes through, here are some moves you can make. If you are interested in kind of creating a more equitable workplace, for example, here are some things you can do. And then the second book up there, Policing the Crisis, that is the OG. Like, Stuart Hall is probably the greatest thinker about this stuff of all time. So if you read those two in the middle, then you'll be like 90% there. And then if you want more recent stuff, that's over here. And the OG kind of like stuff is on that side. So that Key on West book is really, really good if you want science and actionable moves that you can make.
Cool. So I know it got kind of deep there, but I wanted to open it up now if anyone feels like they've got a burning question to our panel.
Especially now that I've rolled my eyes at you and said, you just grow up. It's like really welcoming.
Yeah, so if you've got a lady down at the front. So if you just want to say your name and then, yeah?
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Mylin, and I'm a 3D environment artist in my final year of games art. But I'm also really interested in games scholarship and research about this kind of stuff, because I think it's important to me as a female woman, like a woman of color, and also just I think important as well for like contextualizing like my practice, because I obviously want to get into making games and promoting and building sort of the diversity that's like really important, but equally I think it's also really important to research and talk about it. So I guess this is, I think everything that's been said is like really insightful, and I guess this is more of like a career sort of question, but I'm really interested in eventually kind of merging my practice of like developing games with sort of doing research about it and stuff, and I was kind of just wondering about what pursuing that kind of pathway would be like.
Do a PhD.
Yeah, that's the eventual goal, but I don't know, like, I feel like I know the sort of the sort of pipeline, I guess, into
Yeah,
doing
I was
research.
joking, but like,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
do a
don't know.
master's first and see if you like it, and then like, yeah, I think. But are you here? Is Satish one of your lecturers?
No,
No?
I'm somewhere else.
Oh, okay.
That's all right, that's allowed.
So I think because funding in the games industry is a bit dicey, one of the things that I've definitely been thinking about is research. Like if a game has genuine research questions where we're going to learn something new, then maybe there's some opportunities there to do. And there's a long tradition of serious games kind of work. So it would depend on the research questions and exact skill sets that you want to bring and stuff like that. But I'm sure there would be like people here or up at Abate who could have like that chat with you. So just like shoot an email to us and we'll be able to advise for sure.
I mean, the other option is to actually work in the games industry and then occasionally get invited to academic conferences.
Yes. Let's not talk about that too much. But yeah.
Well, so for me, like my advice is always to center your interest in something personal. So I always love it when students, they want to produce environmental artwork. And I always ask them to look inwards, like where are you from, where are your parents from, like what is the unique aspect of your identity and your hometown, and I want to see that represented, not just another war zone. And I think that applies to everyone as well, not just people of color. I think that one game I was playing was Thank Goodness You're Here, like quintessentially northern, hilarious. So I want to see more of that, and I want to explore. I'm really interested in exploring what place means in video games. So wherever you go on your journey, I think just keep a focus on what really interests you and what is personal, and you'll find a niche eventually through that path. Maybe a master's, maybe a PhD. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. Sure.
Yeah, my name's Yusuf. I'm a game programmer. It's a bit of a long question, so I tried to cut it down as much as I could. But you discussed how recent anti-DEI in America might affect gaming on a broader scale, but I was wondering about some specifics in the UK. So I imagine companies that were completely based in the UK won't necessarily be affected too much, but what I'm more curious about is, for some context, I have a contact that used to work at Epic Games, and as you might know, Epic Games is primarily based in the US. The last time I spoke to them, they told me that the culture at Epic Games was very diverse. It was very it was very open at that time, but of course they're not there anymore, so they can't confirm with me anymore. But I was curious how you think the current situation in the US would affect US companies that are based in the UK rather than like how would it affect, you know, the work culture? How would it affect, you know, would titles have less diversity in them? You know, because the games are being made in the UK, yeah, but I'm pretty sure they're being managed in the US, right? Or that's where they decide things. So I was curious how you.
I mean, personally, I think that there'll be a short-term influence. You know, most political figures, or I'm not going to get specific, most political figures are only in power for 3-4 years or whatever it is. So I would hope within a 3-4 year window, things will change. And games take a long time as well. So personally, I just try and ride it out and hope for the best. But, you know, I don't know what you guys
Yeah, with
think.
the tariffs as well, maybe there won't be an economy. It might all be moot.
Remember the economy.
Yeah.
That was great.
Yeah, was it yay or nay on the economy? Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this also really comes down to, I think this is where you really find out what the company culture is really like. If these ideas have been really bedded in, then they will ride this out. And if it was surface level, then it will be proved to be surface level. So I think a lot of employees will be seeing actually the reality of whether their leadership truly like believes in these ideas. Yeah, and I think I think with a lot of this, I think it's just I think the tariffs are also going to be really interesting. I think the massive layoffs as well. The American games industry, I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that happened in the last 2 years or so that I think we're only going to see the downstream effects of in like 3 to 4 years as well. Because I think there's also going to be, like, I think now there's loads of really interesting AAA games coming out, but they've like decimated, you know, many of the AAA studios have like decimated the expertise in there. And I think you're going to see those impacts happening in kind of 4 years. So as someone who does somewhat wish for the fall of the American empire, I mean, I think it's an interesting moment. You know, culturally as well,
I mean,
to decenter it.
There are huge changes like taking place and new alignments of like just massive forces around the world, and that's definitely going to have like big effects on who works with whom and under what conditions.
Absolutely. And I think the UK games industry, I think I would be very unsurprised if there are lots of people having conversations about how they could use this as a moment to really like kind of take up their role. I mean, the UK punches above its weight anyway, in terms of like the games industry, but also, you know, I've had conversations with people working in like film and TV where they're like, yeah, it behooves us to like maybe decouple our market a little bit, like our industry from America. You know, and I think there's an opportunity like for lots of people to like start taking up that mantle, perhaps, you know, it's, I think.
I think the Anglosphere has kind of gone a little bit crazy over the last sort of decade. So that sort of the ramifications of that may mean, as you say, like maybe we'll get a bit closer to Europe in some ways. There'll be new opportunities that arise from that. Money always comes with strings, but the exact way that works, I think, as you say, it like depends on local leaders and local kind of like possibilities. So.
Okay, well,
Yeah,
I think we'll just have one more question and then we'll shift to a break.
Thank you. My name is Jasmine and I'm an artist and educator, but digital artist, so I make art games sometimes. And I'm wondering, like, within the art, like contemporary art sphere, there's a rise of games. It's still kind of niche, but not so niche, and it's a growing market. Galleries are becoming really aware of that and trying to invest more in digital infrastructure to exhibit this kind of stuff. The sort of art games that I see are super political, very diverse, addressing all of these things that we've been speaking about. I suppose my question is, does that affect games? Do we see the two industries uniting a little bit? Any personal experiences with this? Does art sit in a really different area? Because I've never been in a traditional games environment. I've only ever known it through the sphere of art. So I just wanted a bit of a more gamey research take on the two disciplines.
Yeah, I love that. I would love it if more fine artists came to actual games conferences, and I'd love if game developers engaged with fine art as well. I do think it's on both sides. Like I've I've spoken with like a whole bunch of fine artists in the like interactive space, and sometimes it's been quite frustrating to me that they have so little knowledge of the commercial games industry, especially if they're maybe wanting to make a commercial game. But you know, like I ended up explaining what an NPC was to a fine artist who was like, I've done this really exciting thing where like these like little blobs like act on their own volition, and I was like, so they're NPCs, right? And then she's like, oh wow, is there a term for? And I'm like, yeah, there is a term for that. Like there are innovations that we have here. I would love to see more cross-pollination across all of these things personally. Like I think that would be great and really healthy for the medium. Yeah, how does that happen? We need to like bus games
well, places,
developers
unfortunately, you
into
know, that's one of the
galleries.
advantages of places like Soda. It's like
That's
a real, you know, we've got these things on the wall called collabs where we bring across people from art and photography and filmmaking, and sometimes it gets messy and sometimes it's a bit of like a culture clash and a language kind of interchange. But I think, yeah, like we said earlier, that the budgets for these AAA games are ballooning, the conservatism in gameplay, you know, kind of goes up with that. So indie is definitely one way to go to explore innovation. But I think the art sphere and the art world is definitely another. So hopefully places like Soda can continue to nurture that.
There are festivals where that crossover, like the MA's festival.
Yeah, that's definitely worth going to if you haven't been. It's so good.
I remember they got sponsored by Razer once, and then all these glowing green gamer computers running just tiny indie games. And it's like, oh, at least the indie games are running at like 90 FPS. Like, it's so nice. But yeah, they're that kind of curatorial space. So there's people like Marie Fulston, like Sarah Brin, who are like doing that curatorial work to bring in those cool art games. But I think it's super exciting, and like, you know, even if fine artists have those misconceptions, to bring the new ideas.
Yeah,
And, like,
yeah, exactly. Like I think there's way more like to be said in the interstices, and I definitely like, you know, people who work in games, please engage with media other than games challenge, you know, level like it's just yeah, I'm always excited. I love it when game developers like go and see a play or read a book or watch a movie that isn't a microwave.
And as an Australian good news story, the Untitled Goose Game guys, they're from a fine arts background. And they made a lot of money from that game. So yeah, it's possible.
There you go. So the message of today is read a book, and Darshanna's given you lots of examples. So I want to say a big thank you to our panelists for today. Thank you.